A lot of times when you're looking at reflection, specifically within the context of transformative learning, so this idea that perspective shifting is happening, it's very easy to think you're looking for whether students have shifted their perspective, but that's actually not what we're really evaluating. We're not evaluating the outcome, we're evaluating the process, the student's ability to understand that experience and make sense of it.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Dr. Cori Crane closes out our season by diving deeper into her recent talk at the LRC on utilizing reflection for language and culture learning.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. We are excited to speak with Dr. Cori Crane today.
Cori gave a talk as part of our monthly LRC speaker series on perspective shifting through structured critical reflection, and we will dive deeper into what this looks like in the language classroom.
Welcome to Speaking of Language, Cori.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with the two of you.
Well, we're glad to have you here for our last episode of the season, and we'd like to start out by asking you, for our listeners, about your background and path with languages.
Oh, well, like many people who are probably listening in on this podcast, it's been a long journey and started when I was younger. So, at a relatively early age in my life, I knew that there were other languages out there. And my mom's from Germany, from southern Germany. I know that's making Angelica smile right now.
Indeed, yes.
And while I didn't grow up with the language, or speaking the language, I should say, I knew it existed. And I actually have more relatives in Germany than I do in the United States from my dad's side. And so I had opportunities at a younger age to learn and practice and work on German. Probably the most formative experience was when I was 14. I lived for a summer in Schwäbisch Hall, which is in Baden-Württemberg, with some relatives of mine. Yeah, and then I studied at a Goethe Institute, which was such a great experience. And I think that summer really just it brought so much joy to me, and it was hard. It was very, very hard. But I also I learned that one can communicate in other languages, and that had a profound impact on the rest of my journey. So I knew that I wanted to study languages when I went to Cornell, and I wanted to study abroad. And then the bug just continued. So after I graduated from college, I knew that I needed to go out and explore more languages in the world. And so I lived for 2 years in Budapest, Hungary, and taught English and German there. And that's really when I realized through that experience that I wanted to pursue language education vocationally. And so the rest is history, as they say.
Nice. Awesome. So, Cori, your talk focused on structured critical reflection. Can you recap the structured reflection triangle for our listeners to set the stage here?
Sure. So this is a framework that has been used in study abroad contexts. It was developed by Anderson and Cunningham, 2004, who were looking at students in advanced courses and in study abroad, trying to understand how it is that they engage in moments of perspective shifting. And so it's a wonderful heuristic that can be used to understand how students engage with different domains of knowing. Mike Sosolsky, with whom I've collaborated on multiple projects within a language learning contexts, he and I developed or adapted basically this framework from Anderson and Cunningham for language educators. And we've been really interested in understanding how it can be used across different levels within a collegiate curriculum. And it has as its explicit goal trying to foster critical thinking, self-awareness, open-mindedness for students, so that they are able, not that everybody experiences this, but that they're able to experience moments of shifting their frames of reference. So what does this look like practically? So the heuristic basically has students or allows us to think about students engaging with three domains of knowing. So one is beliefs and assumptions that students have prior to coming to the course or in an instructed environment. Of course, those beliefs and views are always changing, so that's a moving target. Actually, all of these are moving targets.
Sure.
Another part of that triangle is the theoretical and conceptual work that is at the center of a particular course. And then a final part of this are the experiences that students have outside of the classroom. And so the idea with this triangle, just like we are in empirical research, we might triangulate data to provide different angles of different perspectives on a particular research question, with the idea that we want to strengthen the confidence in our findings. The structured reflection triangle allows students to find moments of consonance and dissonance between these different domains of knowing. From a transformative learning perspective, we would be interested in seeing where those moments of dissonance appear, because those are ones when they're really explored by students, by individuals, that can lead to shifting one's beliefs, one's assumptions, whether it's a small sort of T transformation or a larger one that refers back to a larger frame of reference.
So that's great. You just mentioned that you implement these practices throughout the entire language curriculum. Can you give us a specific example of what this would look like, especially at different proficiency levels?
Sure. So we've used it in beginning levels, where we would maybe ask students at the very start, what is your assumption about German? In this case, we've been working with the German language. What does it mean to learn a language? And that's a really powerful first point of reflection for students at the beginning stages, because they come in with a lot of assumptions about the language learning process, and even the language that they are excited to learn about, but sometimes they have very negative assumptions, or complex ones that really need to be interrogated. And so even at the beginning levels, that might be our reflection focus. At more advanced ones, for example, a few years back, I was teaching an advanced L2 course, second language course on sociolinguistics, although I did have a few native speakers of German in that course as well. And there, the focus for the reflective work was linguistic variation. So we had students look at, examine their evolving understanding of this really central construct in sociolinguistics work, which is how do languages vary, what are linguistic varieties,
Sure.
et cetera. And that's work that I did with Brian Barnett, who was simultaneously at the University of Minnesota teaching a course on Louisiana French. Brian and I have been investigating how students evolve in their understanding of linguistic variation across our courses through the use of written structured reflection. So a key part would be obviously identifying what the reflective focus is going to be for a particular course, whether it's a beginning level course, an intermediate level course, low advanced, more advanced coursework, thinking about the materials that students are going to engage with within the course that will allow them to reflect critically on the content at hand, and then providing opportunities. This is the key thing, providing opportunities, regular opportunities throughout the course of the semester for students to articulate their assumptions and go back to those assumptions, what Jenny Moon refers to as a secondary type of reflection, going back to the primary reflection in light of what they're learning. And so staging it in a way that shows continuous reflection across a course is really key, without it leading to reflection fatigue. So I've I've found that some semesters 5 is way too much,
Yeah.
but three seems to work fairly well, or 4 even.
Okay. So you just laid out how this is a broad reflection for your students on their own language learning processes and assumptions they may hold. Can these practices also help support language development of our students? So I guess what I'm asking is, in the beginning level, obviously these reflections would happen in English or in the first language of the
Right.
students. But is there also a point where that switches maybe, where you encourage students to do that reflection in the target language?
Sure. Well, I mean, there are two things to say here. First of all, there seems to be good evidence that just reflecting on one's own learning experiences supports learning in general. So we know that in any language, this is going to be meaningful for students' language development. The work that Mike and I did, for example, this is the Foreign Language Annals article that came out in 2020. We examined students' perceptions of using structured reflection
Mm,
across two different curricula from beginning levels to more advanced levels. And we found one of the key themes that came up for those students, and the majority did, in fact, find structured reflection to be valuable for them for their learning. We found that it helped them think about their own learning. It helped them organize their learning. In some cases, it helped them shift perspectives about the things that they were learning about. So so that alone is already really powerful, and just giving students the ability to think about what learning means to them, and how they're evolving. Like really be involved in their own learning, I think is super powerful and
hmm
is really underestimated. Now to your question about what language to do this in. I think this is really difficult, complex work. It might seem at first glance when you're doing reflection work that it's really easy, but I've been doing it for a while, and even just last week, having our last class in my German 102 class,
hmm
and students had a reflection that they had to write at the very end that recapped everything that they had been, not everything, but a lot of the work that they had been doing, specifically integrated performance assessments, which was the focus of our reflective work there. And my student who's graduating this semester, one of my students this semester said, um, you know, this was really, really hard. This was
Mm,
really hard work.
yeah.
And I had to laugh because I'm like, yes, it is. It's not easy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and he also did an amazing job
Mm,
in that reflection, and was able to think. He was able to look at himself and his own commitment level to German
mm.
in a really authentic way. I was really proud of him. So it was
Nice.
also, I mean, there was also the side benefit for the teachers too, in being able to be a witness of
Sure.
and somebody who's a participant in the students' work. Okay, now really back to your question. So yeah, so I think this critical reflection work wouldn't be it couldn't it's hard to imagine it happening at a lower
Sure.
proficiency level, just because students need language to be able to
Of
do
course.
that work.
Yep.
Yeah, and so, but I have been doing it in more advanced level courses, and Mike Sisolsky, whom I mentioned earlier, has also used structured reflection in his advanced German coursework, and there too, it's not that easy for students, and so this is an area that I think we need a lot of people looking at this. What does it mean to reflect in another language?
hmm hmm
And what does this genre look like? What are the discursive strategies and tips to help students engage critically? And so
Mhm.
I'm excited to that will be sort of hopefully my
hmm
next step in
Nice.
this work.
Very cool. So, to follow up on that a little bit, how can we assess our students' reflective work in language classes? Or, since it's a very personal practice and it's subjective, should we evaluate our students' reflective work in language classes?
Yeah, well, I think we should be, but the feedback, it would be the key part of it, and also knowing what it is that thinking about the criteria. What is it that we need to be looking at when we're reading a student's written reflection, or if there's some sort of classroom reflection, this perhaps guided discussion that's taking place. So I think, Mike and I have developed a rubric that we have found to be useful and usable from beginning to advanced levels. It considers things like completeness. It considers things like specificity, as contrasted with vagueness. Is there rich detail, rich description? That seems to be one of the key. Rich description and detail is one of the key criteria that come up when you start looking at critical reflection in instructed environments. So that's part of it. But we've also added, and this reflects the structured reflection triangle model, connection making. So our students making connections between their assumptions, between and that what they're learning in the classroom and experiences that they're having outside of the classroom. That, of course, means that they actually have experiences to draw on, but we're not asking them to relay everything. We're more interested in the quality of the reflection. So in all of the prompts that we've given to our students, we've asked them to talk about one or two key ideas that they then would have to dig a bit deeper into. And then writing clarity is never a bad thing to add to any rubric.
Sure. Yep.
But, I think one thing, if I may, a lot of times when you're looking at reflection, specifically within the context of transformative learning, so this idea that perspective shifting is happening, it's very easy to think you're looking for whether students have learned or whether they have shifted their perspective, but that's actually not what we're really evaluating. We're not evaluating the outcome. We're evaluating the process.
Yep.
And I think that sometimes trips teachers up too, because they feel like, oh, I can't evaluate, I can't judge this experience. That's not what you're doing. You're evaluating the ability to dive into that experience and try to understand it, the student's ability to understand that experience and make sense of it, make sense of the experience in light of what they've been learning in the classroom. And of course, it depends on what the prompt looks like, and it depends on what the whole reflection trajectory looks like in a program.
Yeah. Can you maybe share a concrete example with us where you have seen perspective shifting happening as a result of critical reflection that a student engaged in?
So there's an example that Mike and I wrote about in a wonderful book that came out a year ago by Betty Lou Lever, Dan Davidson, and Christine Campbell on transformative language learning. And we are just one of many contributions in this lovely book. But our chapter focuses specifically on assessing critical reflection for transformative learning. And so the example that we have is of a student in a beginning level classroom who was trying to make sense of her assumption about German as a harsh language. And she had grown up hearing German from her grandmother, and apparently it involved a lot of screaming and yelling. So she had developed this very common assumption about German, that it was a harsh language. And this is something I've also found in some of my other work, that just it commonly appears in students, beginning students' understandings or assumptions about the language. Every language has these, right? I mean, it's
Sure.
So when she started to investigate, like in her second and third journals, when she started to go back to that first baseline reflection and then think about the experiences she was having both in the classroom and outside the classroom, she realized that her grandmother was actually not speaking that much German to her. She was speaking English to her, but had inserted at various points, I guess, when they were talking, moments of what sounded like these sort of harsher sounds, exclamations. And it was the point, she really realized this, according to her reflection, when she was listening to or watching movies as part of extracurricular activities. And suddenly she's realizing, oh, this is actually meaningful discourse. This is somebody is talking and I am understanding it, and it's quite beautiful. So, it was this moment of clarity for her, that where she was also recognizing that language was making sense. Like listening to
Nice.
German
Yeah.
was actually making sense to her. It wasn't just a bunch of random sounds. So I think that was, for us, that was a powerful moment, even though it's a small t transformation of a particular assumption.
Sure.
So, what can our colleagues do in their first week of teaching in the new year to integrate critical reflection into their teaching?
There are a lot of things teachers can do, and it really depends on what teachers' experiences are with reflection to begin with. I think a lot of teachers are accustomed to building reflection into their classes
Yeah.
at end points, whether it be at the end of a course, at the end of an instructional unit, perhaps at the end of a task. But they're probably, but they may not be necessarily doing it earlier. And this is what I would advocate for. And this would be the transformative learning perspective that you see, for example, in the work by Stephen Brookfield, or Patricia Cranton, Jack Mesereau, basically setting up opportunities early on for students to articulate their baseline understandings of what it is that you want them to then later think about. And of course, sometimes we can't predict that, but there's some ways you can do that. I mean, one is what Mike and I have been advocating in our scholarship, setting up actual reflection moments, maybe a week into the semester or at the beginning of a new instructional unit. So having students write a short paragraph in English, if we're talking about lower division classes. What is your understanding of the German language? Or, for example, we're working with integrated performance assessments. So asking students before we do an IPA, this is the topic we're going to be covering. What do you know about this particular topic?
Yeah.
Whether it be a particular German film or genre, et cetera. And then having them at the end of that instructed experience go back to the original reflection and think about what it is that they've learned. Now, some students will already have those assumptions, even if we don't ask them to do that primary initial
Yeah.
reflection. But I think it can be really hard to go back unless you've committed it to in some sort of recorded fashion to. And I can just speak for myself. It's if I don't have it written down or articulated in some
Sure.
way, it's so hard to know exactly where I was in the starting point.
Yeah.
So that's one. And then, and if that's too much, maybe a teacher doesn't have that much room to build that sort of reflection in. Even just asking a few questions or building in a few more questions at a start of semester background questionnaire. That's what Brian Barnett and I did, for example, in our study on French and German sociolinguistics courses. And so in our opening start of semester survey, which was in English, we asked students, in addition to the typical things like, how do you want to be referred to in the classroom? What are you hoping to gain in the course? We asked them, how do you understand the notion of linguistic variation? What does that mean to you? Have you heard this before? And then we were able to ask that again at the very end of the semester. And of course, we had them engage with this construct through the actual structured reflections, which was part of the course. But there are ways that you can build it in, and there are also some other low key ways to build in reflection in a formative way. But if you don't have that baseline, I think it's really hard to then ask students to reflect honestly and authentically about what it is that they've learned and ways in which their frames of reference have become more open-minded.
Nice. Cori, where can our listeners find out more about your work?
Well, I've referenced already a few pieces. So there are probably three that I would suggest if people are interested in critical reflection and specifically from a transformative learning perspective. So if you're interested in learning about it from a curricular perspective, the piece that Mike Sosolsky and I have in the 2020 issue of Foreign Language Annals. Oh, and then the piece that Mike and I have in the recent book by Betty Lou Lever, Dan Davidson, and Christine Campbell on transformative language learning. And then I have a piece also in one of the AAUSC volumes, now called the Journal of Second Language Research and Practice, on reflections being used in beginning level German classes, specifically looking at the notion of connection making and how we can facilitate that at beginning levels.
Nice. And I assume all of that stuff is also listed and linked on your website, right?
It is, yes.
CoriCrane.com, people. There you have it.
We'll, of course, have a link to CoriCrane.com in our show notes. Well, Cori, this has been lovely. It's great to get to chat with you. But before we sign off, we'd like to ask you to share a word in a language you speak, love, are learning, want to learn that makes you laugh. What is that word?
Oh, there's so many.
Good.
I'm gonna share one that is actually not German, but it sounds German, and I bet Angelica has heard about this term. Maybe Sam, you have too. Have you heard about Freudenfreude?
I just heard about this. I'm, of course, very familiar with Schadenfreude, as I think a lot of people are, but
Right.
I heard about this very recently. I think over the last couple of days, I saw something on social media about it. So why don't you explain to everyone? Because now I'm all excited.
It's this idea. So Freude, Andi Freude. Freude is, of course, joy. So it's this feeling of joy and sincere happiness for someone else's success, even when you are not directly impacted by that success, which I think is lovely. And even if it doesn't necessarily it does come from German, but it's not necessarily regularly used in German yet.
There we go.
I think it's a lovely term.
It is, absolutely. And I think that is a perfect term to end our season on.
I
Right?
agree.
Being
It's
happy for the happiness in others. I like it.
Yes.
Yes.
That is very good. Cori, thank you so much for speaking of language with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
With this episode, our 10th season of Speaking of Language comes to an end. We will be back in the new year with new topics and new guests.
In the meantime, you can listen to our archived shows on our website at lrc.cornell.edu, on the Apple or Google Podcasts app, or wherever you get your podcasts. We wish all of our listeners a wonderful, safe, happy, and healthy holiday season.
Until next year.
Auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
Or follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelica Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.